Flames licked the night sky as Elizabeth James watched her family's barn burn to ashes, her heart turning to cinders with each crackling beam that collapsed. The fire cast an eerie glow across her tear-streaked face as she stood frozen in the dirt yard, barefoot in her nightgown, helpless against the destruction unfolding before her. "Everything I had left," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the roaring inferno. The year was 1885, and Elizabeth Eliza to most folks had already lost more than most people twice her age. At 22, she'd buried both parents within 6 months of each other, leaving her alone to manage their struggling ranch outside Oatman, Arizona. The parched land yielded little, but the barn had sheltered the few livestock that kept her from complete destitution. Now even that was gone. Behind her, hoofbeats thundered in the darkness. Eliza didn't turn. She knew who it was: Harris Clayton's men. They'd warned her last month that if she didn't sell her land to the copper mining company, she'd regret it. Eliza hadn't believed they'd go this far. "Miss James." A deep voice called out, different from Clayton's thugs. She whirled around to see a tall figure dismounting from a chestnut stallion. As he approached, the firelight revealed a face she recognized but hadn't spoken to: Blake Novak, the new rancher who'd bought the old Wilson property last winter. He removed his hat as he approached, revealing dark hair and concerned eyes that reflected the dancing flames. "Are you hurt?" he asked, scanning her for injuries. Eliza shook her head, too numb for words. Her entire future was disappearing in smoke and cinders before her eyes. Blake surveyed the destruction, his jaw tightening. "Clayton's men," she nodded, surprised he'd guessed so quickly. "I saw them riding fast from this direction," he explained. "Recognized Fallen's paint horse." He looked back at the burning structure, then to her face. His expression softened from anger to determination. "We'll rebuild it, Miss James, twice as strong." Eliza stared at him, momentarily forgetting the catastrophe. "We neighbors help neighbors out here," Blake said simply, as if volunteering to rebuild someone's livelihood was as ordinary as borrowing a cup of sugar. "You can't handle this alone." "I don't accept charity, Mr. Novak." "It's not charity, it's survival." His eyes held hers steadily. "And call me Blake." The barn gave one final, tremendous groan before the roof collapsed completely, sending a shower of sparks skyward. Eliza flinched, and Blake instinctively stepped closer as if to shield her. "There's nothing more to be done tonight," he said gently. "Do you have somewhere safe to sleep?" "The house is untouched," she replied, glancing toward the small, weathered homestead her father had built 20 years earlier. Blake nodded. "I'll be back at first light with my men. We'll clear the debris and start planning the rebuild." His gaze traveled to the horizon where the silhouettes of Clayton's men had disappeared. "And I'll have a few words with Harris Clayton." "No." Eliza grabbed his arm. "That's exactly what they want, an excuse to run you off too. Clayton's got the sheriff in his pocket." Blake looked down at her hand on his arm, then back to her face. Something unspoken passed between them, a current of understanding that surprised them both. "All right," he conceded, "but this isn't over." As he mounted his horse to ride back to his ranch, Eliza called out, "Why would you help me? We've barely spoken 2 words." Blake settled into his saddle, silhouetted against the dying flames. "Because my pa taught me that standing by while good people suffer isn't just cowardice, it's complicity." He tipped his hat. "Rest now, Miss James. Tomorrow we rebuild." Eliza watched him disappear into the darkness, wondering if she'd dreamed the entire exchange. But as she turned back to face the smoldering ruins of her barn, a strange new feeling kindled in her chest, something she hadn't felt since before her parents died. Hope. The sun rose mercilessly bright the next morning, illuminating the charred skeleton of what had once been the James family barn. Eliza had barely slept, spending most of the night moving her surviving animals, 2 milk cows, a draft horse, and 4 chickens to makeshift shelters. Her hands were raw, her eyes burning from smoke and exhaustion. She was dragging a heavy beam from the debris when the sound of wagon wheels and horses approached. Blake Novak led a procession of 3 wagons loaded with lumber, tools, and 5 ranch hands. He rode ahead on his chestnut stallion, his expression determined. "You came," Eliza said, unable to hide her surprise. Blake dismounted in one fluid motion. "I said I would." He gestured toward the wagons. "Brought supplies to get started. These are my men Hank, Joe, Miguel, Finn, and Thomas." The men nodded respectfully, already unloading supplies with practiced efficiency. "Mr. Novak," she began. "Blake," he corrected. "Blake," she conceded. "I can't pay for all this." He shook his head. "We'll work something out. Maybe you can help with the spring roundup." "I hear you're handy with a lasso." Eliza bristled. "Who says?" A hint of a smile crossed his face. "The same folks who say you're the most stubborn woman in the Arizona territory." He removed his coat and rolled up his sleeves. "Now, where do you want the new barn?" By midday, the wreckage had been cleared and the foundation for the new structure was taking shape. Eliza worked alongside the men, refusing to be relegated to bringing water and food. Blake watched her with growing respect as she handled heavy lumber and drove nails with precision. "Where'd you learn to build?" he asked during a brief water break. Eliza wiped sweat from her brow, leaving a streak of dirt. "My father believed daughters should learn the same skills as sons." Blake nodded thoughtfully. "Smart man." "He was," she replied, a flash of grief crossing her features. "Until the fever took him last fall." "I'm sorry," Blake said simply. A comfortable silence fell between them as they watched the frame of the new barn take shape against the cloudless blue sky. "It'll be stronger than before," Blake noted. "We're using a better support system." "Just like me," Eliza said quietly. Blake looked at her curiously. "Every time something tries to break me," she explained, "I come back stronger." A slow smile spread across his face. "I believe that." Their moment was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. 3 riders appeared on the road. Harris Clayton, flanked by his foreman, Fallon and Raid. Eliza tensed, and Blake moved subtly in front of her. Clayton was a barrel-chested man in his 50s with a meticulously groomed beard and cold eyes. He reined his horse to a stop, surveying the construction with evident displeasure. "Well, well," he drawled. "Looks like you found yourself some help, Miss James." His gaze shifted to Blake. "Interesting choice of friends, Novak." Blake didn't respond immediately, instead turning to his men. "Keep working," he instructed before facing Clayton again. "Something we can help you with." Clayton's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Just checking on my neighbor after such a terrible accident. Barns catch fire so easily, don't they? Especially when folks are stubborn about business matters." Eliza stepped forward, ignoring Blake's warning glance. "There was nothing accidental about it, Clayton. Your men rode from here right after it started." "Serious accusation, Miss James. Got any proof?" Clayton's voice was silky. "We all know what happened," Blake interjected. "But unlike some, we build things up instead of burning them down." Clayton's face hardened. "Careful, Novak. You're new around here. Would be a shame if your place met with a similar accident." Blake took a step closer to Clayton's horse, his hand casually resting near his holstered revolver. "Would be a shame indeed, especially since I've got 6 men who sleep in shifts, all with very itchy trigger fingers." The tension crackled between them until Clayton finally chuckled. "Just being neighborly, checking on the poor widow's daughter. No need for threats." He tipped his hat mockingly at Eliza. "You reconsider my offer, you know where to find me." As they rode away, Blake turned to Eliza. "What offer?" she sighed, running a hand through her loose hair. "He wants my land for the mining operation, says there's copper beneath it." "Is there?" "I don't know," she admitted. "But this land is all I have left of my family. I'm not selling, not to him." Blake studied her face for a moment. "Well, let's make sure you have a place to keep your livestock then. One problem at a time." They worked until sunset, making remarkable progress. As Blake's men packed up to leave, he lingered behind. "I'll be back tomorrow," he promised. "Lock your doors tonight." Eliza nodded, suddenly aware of how alone she would be once he left. "Thank you, Blake. I don't know why you're doing all this, but thank you." He looked at her for a long moment, as if debating something internally. "Have dinner with me," he finally said. "Tomorrow night after we finish work." Eliza blinked in surprise. "Dinner?" "Yes, dinner, that meal people eat in the evening." His eyes twinkled with unexpected humor. "I have a housekeeper who makes the best stew this side of the Mississippi." Eliza hesitated, caught off guard by the invitation. "All right." Blake's smile transformed his whole face, softening the hard lines earned from years under the harsh western sun. "Good. I'll have you home before dark." After he left, Eliza stood in the yard watching the sun sink behind the distant mountains, wondering what exactly she'd gotten herself into. The half-built barn stood as a testament to unexpected kindness, and for the first time in months, she felt something other than grief and determination. She felt anticipation. The next day passed in a blur of activity. True to his word, Blake arrived with his men at dawn, and they worked steadily through the morning. By mid-afternoon, the barn's frame was complete, and they began installing the roof supports. Eliza climbed up to help secure the high beams, much to Blake's evident concern. "You sure you should be up there?" he called from below. She peered down at him, amused. "I've been climbing higher than this since I was 10. Worry about yourself, Mr. Novak." Blake shook his head but continued working, occasionally glancing up to check on her. Eliza found his concern both irritating and oddly warming. As they worked side by side throughout the day, she found herself studying him when he wasn't looking. He was different from the cowboys and ranchers she'd known all her life. There was a quiet steadiness to him, a thoughtfulness behind his actions. He spoke little but listened intently, and when he did speak, his words carried weight. "Where are you from originally?" she asked as they shared a brief lunch of cornbread and jerky. "Pennsylvania," he replied. "Coal country. My father was a miner until the cave in that killed him." "I'm sorry," Eliza said softly. Blake nodded acknowledgement. "My mother remarried, and my stepfather was cruel. Left home at 16, worked cattle drives across the plains until I saved enough to buy my own spread." He glanced at her. "What about your family?" "They came from the east too, Georgia," Eliza replied. "My father fought for the Confederacy, though he rarely spoke of it. After the war, he brought my mother west for a fresh start." She looked around at the arid landscape. This was her dream as much as his. She loved the openness, the wildness of it. "And you?" Blake asked. "Do you love it too?" Eliza considered the question. "It's the only home I remember, and despite everything," she gestured to the partially built barn, "I can't imagine leaving." Something in Blake's expression softened. "Some places get into your blood." "Yes," she agreed, finding unexpected understanding in his eyes. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Blake called a halt to the day's work. The barn was taking shape, walls partially up, roof structure in place. Another day or two would see it completed. "We've made good progress," he said, surveying their work with satisfaction. "You have time to get ready for dinner." Eliza suddenly remembered their arrangement, and a flutter of nerves rose in her stomach. "Yes, of course, I just need to change." Blake nodded. "I'll hitch up the buggy." Half an hour later, Eliza emerged from her house wearing her one good dress, a simple blue cotton with white piping that had belonged to her mother. She'd pinned her hair up and washed the dust from her face. Blake stood waiting by a smart two-seat buggy, and she noticed he'd changed too. His shirt was clean, his hair damp from washing. He stared at her for a moment longer than was proper, then seemed to catch himself. "You look lovely, Miss James." "Eliza," she corrected, feeling a blush rise to her cheeks. "If I'm to call you Blake, then you should call me Eliza." He smiled and offered his hand to help her into the buggy. "Eliza it is, then." The ride to Blake's ranch took them through rolling hills dotted with sagebrush and prickly pear cactus. The evening light painted everything in golden hues, softening the harsh landscape. They passed a small creek where cottonwoods grew in a sinuous line, marking the precious water source. "Your land has better water access than mine," Eliza observed. "One reason I bought it," Blake agreed. "Though the previous owner let the irrigation ditches fall into disrepair, spent most of the winter fixing them. Is that why we didn't see you in town much?" Blake glanced at her, a slight smile playing at his lips. "You noticed I wasn't around." Eliza looked away, flustered. "Small town, people notice newcomers." Was all he said, but his smile lingered. As they crested a hill, Blake's ranch came into view. It was larger than Eliza had imagined, a sprawling single-story house with a wide porch, several outbuildings, and two large corrals. A windmill turned lazily above a water tank, and smoke curled from the stone chimney. "It's beautiful," she said honestly. "It needed work when I bought it," Blake replied. "Still does, but it has good bones." As they pulled up to the house, an older woman appeared on the porch, wiping her hands on an apron. She had iron-gray hair pulled into a severe bun and sharp eyes that assessed Eliza immediately. "Mrs. Abernathy, this is Miss Elizabeth James," Blake introduced as he helped Eliza down from the buggy. "Eliza, this is Mrs. Abernathy, who keeps me fed and makes sure I don't live like a complete savage." The woman's stern expression softened slightly. "Pleased to meet you, Miss James. I've heard a great deal about you." Eliza raised an eyebrow at Blake, who suddenly seemed very interested in tying up the horse. "All good things, I hope," she replied. "That remains to be seen," Mrs. Abernathy said cryptically. "Dinner is ready whenever you are, Mr. Novak." The interior of Blake's home was surprisingly refined for a bachelor rancher. Simple but good quality furniture filled the rooms. Bookshelves lined one wall, and clean curtains hung at the windows. A fire crackled in the stone fireplace, casting a warm glow across the polished wooden floor. "Your home is lovely," Eliza said, noticing small touches that spoke of care and permanence. A quilt draped over a chair framed sketches of landscapes, a vase of wildflowers on the dining table. "Thank Mrs. Abernathy for that," Blake replied. "Left to my own devices, I'd probably still be eating off crates." Dinner was indeed as remarkable as Blake had promised: venison stew rich with vegetables, fresh baked bread, and an apple pie that melted in Eliza's mouth. They ate in the dining room, with proper china and silverware that Eliza suspected Mrs. Abernathy had insisted upon. As they ate, their conversation flowed more easily than Eliza had expected. Blake asked thoughtful questions about her ranch, listening intently to her answers. She found herself speaking of things she rarely shared: her fears about maintaining the property alone, her determination to honor her parents' legacy, her occasional loneliness in the quiet house. "You have family elsewhere?" Blake asked, as Mrs. Abernathy cleared away the dinner plates. Eliza shook her head. "My mother had a sister in St. Louis, but we lost touch years ago. My father was an only child." She looked up at him. "What about you? A brother in Denver? Railroad man?" Blake accepted a cup of coffee from Mrs. Abernathy. "We ride occasionally, but he's not one for ranching." After dinner, Blake suggested a short walk to see the corrals where he kept his prized horses. The night was clear, stars scattered like diamond dust across the black velvet sky. A three-quarter moon provided enough light to see by, casting long shadows across the yard. "That one there," Blake said, pointing to a sleek black stallion watching them from the corral, "is Thunder. Best cutting horse I've ever trained." Eliza approached the fence and the horse trotted over, nudging her outstretched hand with velvety nostrils. "He likes you," Blake observed, sounding surprised. "He's magnificent," Eliza said, stroking the horse's forehead. "My father would have admired him." "Your father raised horses." "He tried," she replied. "Had dreams of breeding cavalry mounts, but the drought 3 years ago forced him to sell most of our stock." She fell silent, remembering her father's face the day they'd watched his prized horses driven away, the defeat in his eyes that had never quite left until the day he died. Blake seemed to sense her sadness. "We should head back. It's getting late, and we have more work tomorrow." As they walked back toward the house, Blake's hand brushed against hers, perhaps accidentally, perhaps not. A jolt of awareness shot through Eliza at the contact, surprising her with its intensity. The buggy ride back to her ranch was quieter, a comfortable silence falling between them. The night had cooled considerably, and Blake insisted she take his coat despite her protests. "Wouldn't want you catching cold," he said simply. "We've got a barn to finish." When they arrived at her house, Blake helped her down from the buggy, his hands lingering slightly at her waist. "Thank you for dinner," Eliza said, suddenly shy, "and for everything else." Blake looked down at her, his face half in shadow, half illuminated by moonlight. For a breathless moment she thought he might kiss her. Instead, he took a small step back. "Get some rest," he said softly. "Tomorrow's another long day." Eliza nodded, oddly disappointed. "Good night, Blake." "Good night, Eliza." She watched from her porch as he drove away, the sound of hoofbeats fading into the night. Only after she'd gone inside and closed the door did she realize she was still wearing his coat. The warmth and scent of him wrapped around her like an embrace. The next 3 days fell into a rhythm of hard work and growing companionship. Blake and his men arrived each morning at dawn, and together they transformed the charred remnants of Eliza's barn into a structure twice the size and far sturdier than its predecessor. The new barn featured a hayloft, separate stalls for her livestock, and even a small tack room, luxuries her father's hastily built structure had never included. On the 4th day, as they were completing the roof, a commotion erupted from the direction of the main road. Eliza, who had been nailing boards along the eastern wall, looked up to see a cloud of dust approaching. "Riders coming," she called to Blake, who was working on the roof. He climbed down quickly, hand instinctively moving to the revolver at his hip. As the dust cleared, they saw a group of 5 men on horseback with Harris Clayton in the lead. Blake moved to stand beside Eliza, his shoulder nearly touching hers. His men gathered around them, tools still in hand but expressions wary. "Afternoon, Clayton," Blake called as the group pulled to a stop. "Twice in 1 week. We're honored." Clayton ignored him, focusing on Eliza. "Nice barn you're getting, Miss James. Shame about the circumstances." His cold gaze swept over the nearly completed structure. "Must have cost a pretty penny." "What do you want, Clayton?" Eliza demanded, same as always. He removed his hat, feigning politeness. "I'm here to make you another offer for this property, double what I proposed before." Eliza crossed her arms. "Not interested." Clayton's false smile hardened. "Miss James, you're being unreasonable. This land is worthless for ranching, but the copper beneath it could make you a wealthy woman." If there's copper here, why not just mine your own land? Blake interjected. You've got thousands of acres. The vein runs through her property, Clayton snapped. The engineers confirmed it last month. Eliza felt a chill. You had someone survey my land without permission, Clayton waved dismissively. Public records indicate potential deposits. I merely confirmed them. He leaned forward in his saddle. Be sensible, girl. You can't run this ranch alone. Take the money and start fresh somewhere else. I believe the lady already declined your offer, Blake said, his voice dangerously quiet. Twice now. One of Clayton's men, the one called Fallen, sneered. Awful protective of the widow's daughter, ain't you, Novak? Got yourself a sweet arrangement here. Blake's expression didn't change, but Eliza felt him tense beside her. You should teach your dog some manners, Clayton, Blake said evenly. Fallen's hand moved toward his holster, but Clayton held up a restraining hand. Another time, perhaps. He regarded Blake and Eliza with cold calculation. I admire loyalty, misplaced though it may be, but business is business. He settled his hat back on his head. My offer stands until the end of the month. After that, well. He looked pointedly at the new barn. Accidents happen. As they rode away, Blake's men muttered angrily among themselves. Eliza realized she was trembling not with fear, but with rage. He threatened us, she said through clenched teeth. Right to our faces. Blake nodded grimly. Clayton's used to getting his way. Men like him don't understand the word no. What do we do? She asked, hating the uncertainty in her voice. Blake looked at her, and something in his expression made her heart skip. We finish the barn, he said simply, and then we figure out how to protect what's yours. That evening, after Blake's men had left, he remained behind to complete some final details on the barn doors. Eliza brought him coffee as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the newly constructed building. It's beautiful, she said, admiring their work. Better than the original ever was. Blake accepted the coffee with a nod of thanks. Should last a generation at least. They stood in companionable silence, watching the deepening twilight. A cool breeze stirred the air, carrying the scent of sage and distant rain. Storm coming, Blake observed, looking toward the western horizon where dark clouds were gathering. We need the rain, Eliza replied. She hesitated, then added, You should stay for supper. It's the least I can do after everything. Blake turned to her, his expression unreadable in the fading light. Are you sure? Of course, she said, suddenly nervous. Unless you need to get back to your ranch, he shook his head. Mrs. Abernathy won't expect me. She's visiting her sister in Prescott until next week. Then it's settled, Eliza said with a decisiveness she didn't entirely feel. Though I should warn you, I'm not half the cook she is. Blake smiled, the first genuine smile she'd seen from him all day. I'd be honored to eat whatever you prepare. Inside her small house, Eliza busied herself with cooking while Blake washed up at the outdoor pump. She prepared a simple meal of salt pork, beans, and cornbread, humble fare but filling. As she worked, she felt an unfamiliar flutter of anticipation. It had been months since she'd cooked for anyone but herself. When Blake entered, his hair still damp from washing, he filled the small kitchen with his presence. Eliza was suddenly acutely aware of how intimate the space felt with just the two of them. Can I help? He asked, looking surprisingly at ease in her home. You can set the table, she suggested, pointing to the dishes in the cupboard. They moved around each other with unexpected coordination, as if they'd shared this domestic routine for years rather than minutes. Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance, and a few moments later, rain began pattering against the windows. Looks like you timed your invitation perfectly, Blake commented as they sat down to eat. I'd have been soaked riding home. Providence, Eliza replied with a small smile. Over supper, their conversation turned to Clayton's visit and the implied threat. "He won't give up easily," Blake warned. "Men like Clayton see resistance as a personal affront." Eliza sighed, pushing her plate away. "I know. My father dealt with him for years, always polite but relentless." "Do you think there really is copper on your land?" "I don't know," she admitted. "But even if there is, this was my parents' home. They're buried on that hill behind the orchard. I can't just sell it to a man who would tear it all up for profit." Blake nodded thoughtfully. "There might be a way to find out for certain without involving Clayton. I know a mining engineer in Tucson who owes me a favor. He could assess your property discreetly." "Why would you do that?" Eliza asked, studying his face in the lamplight. Blake met her gaze steadily. "Because you deserve to make an informed decision, whatever you choose." The rain intensified, drumming on the roof and streaming down the windows. A flash of lightning illuminated the room briefly, followed by a crash of thunder that seemed to shake the small house. "That was close," Eliza said, rising to check that the windows were securely latched. As she reached for the kitchen window, another lightning strike lit up the yard, revealing 3 mounted figures approaching the barn. "Blake," she gasped. "Someone's out there." He was beside her instantly, peering through the rain-streaked glass. "Clayton's men," he muttered, reaching for his gun belt. Eliza grabbed a shotgun from above the door. "They're after the barn again." "Stay here," Blake ordered, heading for the door. "Not a chance," she retorted, following him out onto the porch. The rain immediately soaked them both as they stepped outside. Through the downpour, they could make out 3 men dismounting near the newly completed barn. One carried what appeared to be a can of kerosene. "Hey!" Blake shouted, firing a warning shot into the air. The men spun around, startled. Eliza recognized Fallen even through the rain. The 3 quickly mounted their horses, but instead of fleeing, they charged toward the house. "Get inside." Blake pushed Eliza behind him, but she held her ground, raising the shotgun. "This is my home," she said firmly. "I'll defend it." As the riders approached, Blake fired another shot, this one deliberately close to the lead rider. The man's horse reared in panic, nearly throwing him. The other 2 pulled up short. "Next one won't miss," Blake called through the downpour. For a tense moment, the riders hesitated, rain streaming off their hats and slickers. Then Fallen spat a curse and wheeled his horse around. The others followed, galloping away into the stormy night. Eliza lowered her shotgun, suddenly aware she was trembling from cold or fear or anger, she couldn't tell. Blake turned to her, water running down his face. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice barely audible above the storm. She nodded, unable to speak. The reality of what had nearly happened, of what might still happen, crashed over her with the force of the rain. "Come inside," she finally managed. "We're both soaked." In the warmth of the kitchen, Blake helped Eliza secure the house, checking all windows and doors while she built up the fire. They moved in sync, communicating with glances and nods rather than words, united by the shared danger. When the house was secured, they stood awkwardly in the small sitting room, both dripping onto the wooden floor. "You need dry clothes," Eliza said practically, though her heart was racing for reasons that had nothing to do with their recent confrontation. "I'll be fine," Blake insisted, though he was visibly shivering. Eliza shook her head. "Don't be stubborn, I have some of my father's things." She disappeared into the back bedroom, returning with a shirt and trousers. "These should fit well enough." Blake accepted the clothes with a grateful nod. "Where can I?" "You can use my father's old room," she said, pointing to a door off the sitting room. "I'll change in mine." Minutes later, they reconvened by the fire, both in dry clothing. Eliza had changed into a simple house dress, her wet hair braided and draped over one shoulder. Blake looked strange and somehow vulnerable in her father's shirt, which was slightly too small across his broader shoulders. "They'll be back," he said without preamble, staring into the flames. "I know," Eliza replied, sinking into a chair beside him. "You can't stay here alone anymore," Blake continued. "Not with Clayton's men making good on their threats." Eliza bristled. "This is my home. I'm not leaving." "I didn't say leave," Blake clarified, "but you need protection." "What do you suggest?" "I can't afford to hire guards." Blake ran a hand through his damp hair, his expression troubled. "I have a proposition." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "My foreman, Joe, has a wife and 3 children. They've been living in town because there's no proper house for them at the ranch yet. If they moved in here temporarily just until Clayton is dealt with, you'd have protection, and they'd have more space than their cramped rooms above the mercantile." Eliza considered the idea. "And what would you get out of this arrangement?" Blake met her gaze directly. "Peace of mind." Something in his voice made her breath catch. The firelight played across his features, softening them, revealing an expression she hadn't seen before. Concern, yes, but something deeper, something that made her pulse quicken. "All right," she agreed softly. "But only temporarily." Blake nodded, relief evident in his posture. "I'll speak to Joe tomorrow." Outside, the storm continued to rage, rain lashing against the windows and thunder rolling across the valley. Inside, a different kind of tension filled the small room, unspoken words and unacknowledged feelings creating a current between them as palpable as the electricity in the storm. "You should stay tonight," Eliza said suddenly. "The roads will be washed out and it's not safe to ride in this weather." Blake looked at her for a long moment. "Are you sure?" "Yes," she said simply. "You can take my father's room." He nodded, understanding the trust she was placing in him. "Thank you." Later, as Eliza lay in her bed listening to the storm and knowing Blake was just across the hall, she found herself wondering how her life had changed so completely in less than a week. From the devastation of losing her barn to the unexpected alliance with Blake Novak. From Clayton's escalating threats to the strange new feelings stirring within her, everything was shifting like sand beneath her feet. Yet oddly, despite the danger and uncertainty, she felt more alive than she had in months. Blake's presence in her home, his steady support and quiet strength, awakened something she'd thought had died with her parents, a sense of possibility, of future, of hope. As she drifted toward sleep, the rain gentled against the roof, its rhythm soothing like a lullaby. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, she knew. But for tonight, at least, she wasn't facing them alone. Joe Martin's family moved into Eliza's home the following afternoon. His wife, Sarah, was a practical, cheerful woman who immediately set about organizing the household with quiet efficiency. Their 3 children, 2 boys aged 10 and 8, and a 6-year-old girl brought noise and life to the small house that had been silent for too long. "It's just until we build something proper at the ranch," Joe explained as they unloaded the family's modest belongings from the wagon. "Mr. Novak's planning a foreman's house come spring." "You're doing me a favor," Eliza assured him. "I'm grateful for the company." Sarah Martin squeezed her hand. "We women need to stick together out here, and my boys can help with the chores." Blake supervised the move, bringing additional supplies and even a rocking chair for Sarah that he'd had loaded on a second wagon. Eliza watched him interact with the children, patiently answering the boys' endless questions about his revolver, lifting the little girl onto his shoulders to pick apples from the tree in the yard, and saw a gentleness that surprised and moved her. "He's a good man, Mr. Novak," Sarah commented as she and Eliza prepared supper that evening. "Joe says he's the fairest boss he's ever had, treats the men with respect." Eliza nodded, unsure how to respond. Her feelings about Blake had become increasingly complicated gratitude mixed with growing admiration, and something warmer she wasn't ready to name. Over the next 2 weeks, they fell into a new rhythm. Joe rode with Blake to his ranch each morning to work, returning at sunset. The boys helped Eliza with her livestock and garden, while Sarah managed the household and taught her daughter letters at the kitchen table. At least one of Blake's other ranch hands was always nearby, keeping watch for Clayton's men. Blake himself visited nearly every day, ostensibly to check on his foreman's family, but staying to share meals and conversation with Eliza. Sometimes they walked the boundaries of her property together, discussing improvements or repairs. Other times they simply sat on the porch in the evening, watching the sunset paint the western sky in spectacular colors. On one such evening, as they shared the porch swing while Sarah put the children to bed inside, Blake broached a subject they'd both been avoiding. "I received a letter from the mining engineer I mentioned," he said. "He can come next month to assess your land." Eliza nodded, watching a hawk circle lazily over the distant hills. "I've been thinking about that." "And?" Blake prompted gently. She turned to face him, tucking one leg beneath her on the swing. "If there is copper here, I need to know. Not for Clayton's sake, but for mine. I need to make decisions based on facts, not fear or sentiment." Blake studied her face in the fading light. "What would you do?" "If the copper is valuable, I don't know," she admitted. "But I would have options. Maybe lease the mining rights but keep ownership of the land, or sell part but not all." She sighed. "My father always said knowledge is power. Right now, Clayton has knowledge I don't." "He's also been quiet lately," Blake observed. "No more threats since the night of the storm." "That worries me more than his bullying," Eliza confessed. "It means he's planning something." As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of approaching horses interrupted the peaceful evening. Blake was on his feet instantly, hand moving to his revolver. Joe appeared in the doorway, shotgun ready, but the riders weren't Clayton's men. As they drew closer, Eliza recognized Sheriff Dawson and his deputy. Her heart sank. The sheriff was firmly in Clayton's pocket, everyone knew it. "Evening, Miss James." "Novak." The sheriff touched the brim of his hat as he dismounted. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his posture that put Eliza on edge. "Sheriff," Blake acknowledged coolly. "What brings you out this way?" Dawson pulled an official-looking document from his vest pocket. "Court order, I'm afraid. Harris Clayton has filed a mineral rights claim on this property, based on territorial law regarding abandoned or improperly maintained homesteads." "That's absurd," Eliza exclaimed. "This land has been continuously worked since my father claimed it 20 years ago." The sheriff avoided her gaze. "Clayton's lawyers argue that since your father's death, the property has fallen into disrepair, constituting abandonment under the law. The territorial judge has ordered an inspection to determine the validity of the claim." Blake stepped forward, taking the document and scanning it quickly. "This is a legal maneuver, nothing more. The inspection doesn't grant Clayton any rights yet." "No," the sheriff agreed reluctantly. "But if the inspector finds evidence of abandonment or insufficient improvement, Clayton can petition for mineral rights regardless of current ownership." Eliza felt cold despite the warm evening. "When is this inspection?" 2 weeks from today." The sheriff finally met her eyes. "For what it's worth, Miss James, I'm just doing my job. I've known your family a long time." "Yet you're helping Clayton steal my land," she replied evenly. The sheriff flinched slightly but didn't deny it. "The inspection team will arrive at noon on the 15th. Good evening to you." As the lawman rode away, Eliza turned to Blake, fear and anger warring in her expression. "He can't do this." "Can he?" Blake reread the document, his jaw tight. It's a loophole in the law designed to prevent speculators from claiming land and letting it sit idle. But it was never meant to be used like this. He looked up, determination in his eyes. We have 2 weeks to make sure this place can't possibly be considered abandoned or improperly maintained. Joe stepped forward. We'll help, Miss James. The men and I. Blake nodded. We all will. Clayton won't win this way either. The next morning, Blake arrived with all 6 of his ranch hands and 3 wagons loaded with supplies. Over the next several days, they worked from dawn to dusk repairing fences, clearing irrigation ditches, patching the roof of the house, and painting every structure on the property. Sarah and Eliza planted a vegetable garden, complete with neat wooden borders. The Martin boys whitewashed the chicken coop and repaired the stone well. Blake brought sheep from his own flock to graze in Eliza's east pasture, making the land look properly utilized. He helped her draft formal documentation of all improvements made to the property since her father's death, creating a paper trail that would be difficult to dispute. As the inspection date approached, Eliza's property had undergone a remarkable transformation. The buildings gleamed with fresh paint, the fences stood straight and sturdy, livestock grazed in well-maintained pastures, and newly planted fields showed promise of future harvests. They can't possibly claim this land is abandoned now, Sarah declared the evening before the inspection, surveying their work with satisfaction. Eliza nodded, though anxiety still gnawed at her. Unless the inspector is already in Clayton's pocket too. Blake, who had come to review final preparations, placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. We've done everything possible under the law. If Clayton tries to cheat, we'll fight him in the territorial court. With what money? Eliza asked, voicing the fear that had haunted her through all their preparations. I can barely afford supplies, let alone lawyers. Blake's expression grew serious. I have savings and connections in Tucson. I can't ask you to do that, she protested. You didn't ask, he replied simply. I offered. Later that night, after everyone else had retired, Eliza found Blake still sitting on the porch, staring thoughtfully at the star-filled sky. She joined him, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders against the cool night air. You should rest, he said without looking at her. Tomorrow will be challenging. I couldn't sleep, she admitted. Too much thinking. Blake nodded, understanding. They sat in companionable silence for several minutes, the only sounds the chirping of crickets and the occasional distant howl of a coyote. Why are you doing all this, Blake? Eliza finally asked the question that had been on her mind for weeks. You barely knew me before the fire, yet you've risked Clayton's enmity, spent your own money, and devoted countless hours to helping me. Blake was quiet for so long that Eliza thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and reflective. When I first came to Oatman, I was looking for a place to belong, somewhere to put down roots after years of drifting. He glanced at her. The day I rode past your ranch and saw you working alone in that garden, your hair coming loose from your bonnet, determination in every line of your body, despite the obvious struggle, something about you stayed with me. Eliza felt her cheeks warm, grateful for the darkness that hid her blush. Then at church socials or in town, I'd hear people talk about poor Elizabeth James, all alone with that failing ranch, he continued. But there was admiration in their voices, not pity. You earned respect through sheer will and hard work. He smiled slightly. I wanted to know that kind of person. And now that you do, Eliza asked softly. Blake turned to face her fully, his expression earnest in the moonlight. Now I can't imagine riding past your gate without stopping, can't imagine this valley without you in it. Eliza's breath caught at the naked emotion in his voice. Before she could respond, he continued. I know the timing is wrong, with everything happening with Clayton and the inspection tomorrow, but I need you to know that my help doesn't come with expectations." His eyes held her steadily. "Except perhaps one that when this is all over, you might allow me to court you properly." The simple declaration, delivered without flourish or pretense, touched Eliza more deeply than any elaborate profession of love could have. It was honest and direct like Blake himself. "I would like that very much," she whispered, her heart racing. Blake's smile transformed his face, erasing the worry lines that had creased his brow for weeks. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, he reached for her hand. When his fingers entwined with hers, the contact sent warmth spreading through her entire body. They sat together under the vast desert sky, hands clasped, surrounded by the land they both loved, while within them bloomed the tender beginnings of something stronger than the challenges that awaited them. The inspection team arrived precisely at noon the next day. The sheriff, a county clerk named Winters whom Eliza didn't recognize, and Harris Clayton himself, looking smugly confident despite the obvious improvements to the property. "Mr. Clayton is here as an interested party," Sheriff Dawson explained uncomfortably when Blake objected to his presence. "He has the right to observe." "Then I'll observe as well," Blake stated, crossing his arms, "on Miss James's behalf." The inspection proceeded methodically, with Winters taking notes and occasionally measuring structures or boundaries. Clayton followed silently, his expression darkening as they moved from one well-maintained area to another. When they reached the new barn, Winters whistled appreciatively. "Fine construction," he commented, examining the joinery. "Recent work?" "Yes," Eliza confirmed. After the previous structure burned down last month, Clayton's expression remained neutral, but his eyes hardened. "Unfortunate accident that." "It wasn't an accident," Blake said pointedly. As witnesses reported to the sheriff at the time, Sheriff Dawson shifted uncomfortably. "No formal charges were filed, because evidence mysteriously disappeared," Blake replied, his tone making it clear what he thought of the sheriff's investigation. Winters, apparently oblivious to the tension, continued his assessment. "Well, regardless, this is clearly a working ranch with substantial improvements." He made more notes in his ledger. "The house is in good repair, barns and outbuildings functional, fields under cultivation, livestock present." He looked up. "I see no evidence whatsoever of abandonment or neglect." Clayton's face flushed with anger. "The improvements are recent, obviously made in response to the inspection notice. Prior to that, the property was falling apart. You have documentation of its prior condition?" Winters asked, raising an eyebrow. Clayton hesitated. "Not specifically, but I have documentation of continuous improvements since my father's death," Eliza interrupted, producing the records Blake had helped her prepare. "Every repair, every new fence post, every acre planted, all dated and witnessed." Winters accepted the papers, flipping through them with interest while Clayton seethed. "These appear quite thorough, Miss James." "This is a farce," Clayton snapped. "She couldn't possibly have maintained this ranch alone. These improvements were clearly made with outside help. The law doesn't specify that a landowner must work alone," Winters pointed out mildly. "Many properties employ hired hands or receive neighborly assistance. The requirement is simply that the land be actively maintained and utilized." "Which it clearly is," Blake added. Winters closed his notebook with an air of finality. "Based on my inspection, I find no grounds for declaring this property abandoned or neglected. The mineral rights claim on that basis is without merit." He turned to Clayton. "Of course, you're welcome to challenge my findings in territorial court, Mr. Clayton." Clayton's face contorted with barely suppressed rage. "This isn't over," he growled, directing his words at Eliza but glaring at Blake. "Not by a long shot." He turned on his heel and stormed to his horse, mounting swiftly and galloping away without waiting for the sheriff. Winters watched him go with a bemused expression. "Unpleasant fellow," he commented. "Well, Miss James, I'll file my report with the territorial office tomorrow. You should receive official notification within 2 weeks, but I can tell you now that your property rights are secure based on my assessment." After the inspection team departed, a spontaneous celebration erupted. Joe's wife Sarah prepared a special dinner, the children decorated the house with wildflowers, and Blake brought a bottle of good whiskey for the adults. The atmosphere was joyous, relief and triumph mingling in equal measure. As twilight descended, Blake found Eliza sitting alone on a boulder near the creek that marked her eastern boundary. She was watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of pink and gold, her expression thoughtful. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, waiting for her nod before settling beside her. "We won," she said softly, almost to herself. "I can hardly believe it," Blake smiled. "You won because you never stopped fighting, even when it would have been easier to give up." Eliza turned to him, her eyes reflecting the golden light of sunset. "I had help. Partners are allowed," he replied, his hand finding hers between them on the sun-warmed stone. "Is that what we are?" she asked. "Partners?" Blake's fingers tightened around hers. "I hope we're becoming something more than that." The sincerity in his voice made her breath catch. For weeks, they'd worked side by side, sharing hardships and small victories, learning each other's strengths and weaknesses. What had begun as neighborly assistance had grown into something neither had anticipated, a bond forged in adversity but flourishing in quieter moments. "Clayton won't give up," she said, voicing the concern that tempered her joy. "He'll find another way." "Probably," Blake agreed. "But neither will we, and now we know his tactics." He turned to face her fully. "Eliza, I meant what I said last night. When this is over, is it ever really over?" she interrupted. "There's always another challenge on the horizon, another drought, another threat, another struggle." She shook her head. "That's the reality of this life we've chosen." "True," Blake acknowledged, "but facing those challenges is easier when you're not alone." He took both her hands in his. "I'm not proposing we wait for some perfect moment of peace that may never come. I'm asking if you'll let me stand with you through whatever comes next, good or bad." Eliza studied his face, the earnest eyes, the strong lines etched by sun and wind, the quiet determination that had drawn her to him from the beginning. In the weeks since he'd ridden to her aid that terrible night, he'd shown his character not through grand gestures but through steady presence, unwavering support, and genuine respect for her independence. "Yes," she said simply, her heart lighter than it had been in months. Blake's smile began slowly, then spread across his face, transforming his usually serious expression. Without words, he leaned forward, his intention clear in his eyes. Eliza met him halfway, her hand rising to his cheek as their lips met in a gentle kiss that carried the promise of deeper passion. When they parted, the last rays of sunlight were fading from the mountains, but neither moved to return to the house. In the growing darkness, they spoke of possibilities, joining their ranches through marriage, combining their herds, planning for a future that seemed brighter than either had dared hope just weeks earlier. The sound of approaching horses broke their reverie. Blake was instantly alert, his hand moving to his revolver as he rose to his feet. "Stay here," he instructed, but Eliza stood with him. "Not a chance," she replied, already moving toward the house where she kept her shotgun. As they neared the yard, they could make out 4 riders in the deepening twilight. Joe had emerged from the house with his shotgun, positioning himself protectively in front of the door where Sarah and the children waited inside. "Who's there?" Blake called out, his voice carrying across the yard. "Territorial Marshal," came the response as the lead rider moved into the light spilling from the house windows. "Thomas Reid, looking for Harris Clayton." Blake and Eliza exchanged surprised glances. The marshal dismounted, followed by 3 deputies. He was a tall man with iron-gray hair and the weathered face of someone who'd spent decades in the saddle. "He's not here," Blake said, lowering his weapon slightly but maintaining a cautious stance. "What business do you have with Clayton?" The marshal approached, eyeing them assessingly before apparently deciding they weren't threats. "Fraud, extortion, and suspected murder. We've been building a case against him for months." He glanced around the property. "This the James Ranch." Eliza stepped forward. "I'm Elizabeth James." "This is my land." Marshal Reid nodded. "You're on our list of witnesses. Clayton's been trying to force you to sell, correct?" "Yes," she confirmed, stunned by this unexpected turn of events. "He tried to claim my property was abandoned to seize the mineral rights. There was an inspection just today, with a fellow named Winters." The marshal smiled slightly at their surprised expressions. "Edward Winters works for the territorial governor's office. We planted him in the county clerk's office 3 months ago after complaints about Clayton started piling up." Understanding dawned on Blake's face. The inspection wasn't coincidental. "No," Reid confirmed. "It was part of gathering evidence. Winters has been documenting Clayton's tactics across the county." He turned to Eliza. "Your case was particularly interesting because of the fire. We suspected arson but couldn't prove it." "Until now?" Blake asked sharply. The marshal's expression hardened. "One of Clayton's men got drunk in Tucson last week and bragged about burning out stubborn ranchers. Our informant heard him specifically mention a female rancher near Oatman who wouldn't sell." Eliza felt a cold fury rise within her at the casual way her livelihood had been destroyed. "So you're arresting Clayton as soon as we find him," Reid confirmed. "He wasn't at his ranch or his mining office. You haven't seen him since the inspection." Blake shook his head. "He rode off angry, didn't say where he was going." The marshal sighed. "We'll keep looking. Probably headed for the border." He tipped his hat to Eliza. "Sorry about your barn, madam. With any luck, Clayton will face justice for that and his other crimes." As the lawman prepared to leave, a thought struck Eliza. "Marshal, what happens to Clayton's mining operations if he's arrested?" "Depends on the outcome of his trial," Reid replied. "If convicted, his assets would likely be liquidated to pay restitution to those he's wronged." He gave her a knowing look, "including compensation for destroyed property." After the marshal and his deputies rode away, a stunned silence fell over the yard. Joe was the first to speak. "Well, I'll be damned," he said, shaking his head in disbelief. "Clayton finally got what was coming to him." Blake turned to Eliza, watching emotions play across her face: shock, relief, vindication, and finally, a quiet joy that lit her eyes from within. "It's really over," she whispered. Blake took her hand. "A new beginning," he corrected gently. As word spread of Clayton's downfall, the community gradually revealed the extent of his intimidation. Numerous small ranchers and homesteaders had faced similar threats and sabotage, but fear had kept them silent. With Clayton gone, people began to rebuild and reclaim their lives. The marshal's prediction proved accurate. Clayton was apprehended attempting to cross into Mexico 3 days later. His subsequent trial in Tucson revealed a pattern of corruption that implicated several local officials, including Sheriff Dawson, who was removed from office and charged as an accomplice. When the dust settled, the territorial court ordered Clayton's assets sold and the proceeds distributed among his victims. Eliza received enough compensation for her burned barn to make substantial improvements to her ranch, though Blake insisted that the new barn they'd built together was superior to what had been lost. It was built with care, not just money, he told her as they inspected the finished structure one evening in late summer. Some things can't be measured in dollars. The same could be said for what had grown between them. In the months since that terrible night of fire, their relationship had evolved from neighborly assistance to deep friendship to something far more profound. They courted properly now, with Sunday rides and picnics by the creek, chaperoned visits, and the occasional dance in town. Blake proposed on a crisp autumn evening beneath the same stars that had witnessed their first real conversation. The ring he offered was his mother's, a simple gold band with tiny diamonds that caught the moonlight. "I love you, Eliza James," he said, his usually steady voice slightly hoarse with emotion. "Will you marry me and make our two ranches one family?" Tears filled her eyes as she accepted both the ring and the future it represented. "Yes," she whispered, "with all my heart." They married in December, when the desert air was cool and clear. The ceremony took place in Eliza's yard, beneath an arch built from timber salvaged from her old barn, a symbol of transformation that wasn't lost on those who knew their story. Joe stood as Blake's best man, and Sarah as Eliza's matron of honor. The Martin children scattered wildflower petals along the makeshift aisle. Their wedding night was spent in Blake's house, soon to be their home, until they could build a new one on the boundary between their properties. As they lay together in the darkness, the barriers of propriety finally removed, Blake traced the delicate curve of Eliza's cheek. "When I rode up to your burning barn that night, I never imagined it would lead us here," he confessed. Eliza smiled in the darkness, her body warm against his. "Out of the ashes," she murmured. "Into the light," he finished, drawing her closer. Spring brought new calves to their combined herds, fresh growth to their fields, and confirmation of what they'd suspected since late winter. Eliza was expecting their first child. The news filled Blake with a mixture of joy and protective concern that amused and touched his wife in equal measure. "I'm pregnant, not made of glass," she reminded him when he tried to prevent her from helping with the spring garden. Blake grinned, placing his hand over the slight curve of her belly. Can't blame a man for treasuring what's most precious to him. As her pregnancy progressed, they made plans and preparations. The mining engineer Blake had mentioned long ago finally visited their property, confirming that there was indeed copper beneath part of Eliza's land, though not as extensive as Clayton had believed. After careful consideration, they decided to lease a small portion for mining, using the proceeds to establish a trust for their child's future and to improve both ranches. "My father would approve," Eliza said as they finalized the agreement. "He always said land should serve the family, not the other way around." In late October, just as the desert heat began to soften into autumn, Eliza gave birth to a son they named David James Novak. He had his father's dark hair and his mother's determined spirit, evident in his lusty cries and the firm grip of his tiny fingers. "He's perfect," Blake whispered, cradling his newborn son while sitting beside Eliza's bed. The wonder in his voice made her heart swell with love for both her husband and their child. "Of course he is," she replied with a tired smile. "He's ours." As their son grew, so did their ranch. The mining lease provided capital for improvements, allowing them to drill a new well, purchase additional breeding stock, and eventually build a larger home where the boundaries of their original properties met a physical representation of their joined lives. 2 years after David's birth, Eliza gave birth to twin girls, Catherine and Grace, who brought a new level of joyful chaos to their household. Blake proved to be a devoted father, as patient with skinned knees and bedtime stories as he was teaching David to ride his first pony. 5 years to the day after Clayton's men had burned Eliza's barn, the Novak family held a celebration. Friends and neighbors gathered in the yard of their new home, sharing food and music as children played beneath the cottonwood trees Blake had planted along the creek. As twilight fell, Blake found Eliza standing near the original barn they'd built together, which now served as a workshop and storage for special equipment. The structure had weathered and aged but remained solid, a testament to careful craftsmanship and shared purpose. "Penny for your thoughts," he said, slipping an arm around her waist. Eliza leaned into his familiar embrace. "I was remembering the night we met, standing right here watching everything burn." She turned to face him. "You said we'd rebuild it twice as strong." Blake smiled, the fine lines around his eyes deepening. "And did we?" "Yes," she replied, thinking not just of the barn but of everything they'd created together, their home, their family, their future. "Stronger than I ever imagined possible." From across the yard, David called for his father to help with the bonfire they were building, while the twins tugged at Eliza's skirts, demanding to know when the cake would be served. "Duty calls," Blake said with a grin, pressing a quick kiss to her lips before heading toward their son. Eliza watched him go, then gathered her daughters close, marveling at how a night of destruction had ultimately led to such abundance. The fire that had threatened to destroy her future had instead forged a new one, tempered by challenges, but made stronger for having overcome them. As she joined her family by the celebratory bonfire, so different from the flames of that fateful night, Eliza realized that sometimes it took losing everything to find what truly mattered. Her enemies had burned her barn, but from those ashes had risen not just a stronger structure, but a stronger woman, one who had found love, family, and a future brighter than she'd dared to dream.